Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing, with your hosts, Mercedes Pohlmeyer and Katja Dev.
You often struggle with knowing how hard to push in an exercise, such as hangboarding or deadlifting. Do you even know if you're trying hard enough? And what does try hard even mean? So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about auto regulation and how to get really clear with what rate of perceived exertion is and some other tools to help you understand how hard you're trying and whether you should be pushing harder or maybe pulling back on your exercises. We'll also talk about how you should be feeling at the end of certain sessions. And this is actually part 1 of 3. So this is actually a series. I want to talk about how to apply RPE and autoregulation to your climbing training and to hangboarding, because this is where I see kind of the confusion of how hard to push for each of those sessions. I also want to talk about how certain intensity is important to support specific outcomes that you're trying to train for example, power, strength, or endurance. And lastly, we'll cover some strategies on how to adjust a session or how to adjust exercises based on RPE and how you feel that day. RPE really comes down to how much energy you have and how your body shows up that day. And this is a reminder that strength without strategy is wasted effort. So let's use autoregulation to help us train smarter. So this topic really came up while I was having a conversation with a friend who was basically doing weighted pull-ups, but not really knowing how hard she should be pushing in those reps. And if it's okay to basically fail on the last rep, oftentimes that feels like the thing we should be doing, pushing really hard so that we can get the gains that we're looking for. So I know that her coach prescribes RPE, and this conversation was a huge eye-opener for me because I know that my clients might also struggle with the same thing, that RPE is actually really difficult to gauge. We can give as many examples as we want as coaches to our clients so that they can really understand what RPE is and what autoregulation is, but really it's continued exploration and experience that you, as the person going through the program, that you're going to be able to understand how hard to push your body. You're going to understand where your limits are in your body. And you do that by continually reflecting on how hard you're pushing in a set and how you feel at the end of a session. So this episode really is to help educate you about what autoregulation is in RPE, but it may not give you the full picture of how it's going to feel in your body until you actually go and do it and practice it. Okay, so let's talk about what autoregulation is. We're going to actually put this into a context of strength training. And then later we'll talk about hangboarding and climbing in later episodes. So autoregulation is a self-adjusting training approach that modifies the workout intensity based on how your body feels and performs on a given day. So every day that you show up, your body is going to be different. Your cells go through a lot of different changes every day, so you can't expect your body to show up the same every day. What we're trying to do with autoregulation is work in the framework of the intensity that we're going for. So if a training program says, hey, we want you to hit 85% of your 1 rep max. Now, if you don't consider RPE and you're just looking at this number, then the program might feel really rigid. One day, 85% will feel very manageable. Another day, 85% of your 1 rep max is going to feel very, very hard. And that's completely normal. So what we're going to do is actually make these percentages more tangible so that you can approach each session and get the most out of it. So why does your body show up different every day? We're going to have fluctuations daily because of sleep and recovery. If, let's say, you didn't get a great night's sleep, that's going to most likely lead to a lower strength output. Fatigue and stress play a really huge role in how your body shows up. So if you have a really high stress job, maybe you have a week of really stressing yourself out at work, then that's also going to produce less power in your training because all of your energy is being used up to deal with the stress. And then another factor is your nutrition and your hydration. If you're not properly fueling, then how can you expect your body to perform at its best? So autoregulation really just helps to manage these fluctuations in real time so that you know when to push in an exercise or when to pull back when you're feeling really fatigued without sacrificing long-term gains. Autoregulation also helps with maximizing your gains so that you can train hard enough to create the adaptations that you need for what your goal training program is for. Okay. And then, really, the last thing, autoregulation helps with reducing risk of injury, basically stopping before technical failure or excessive fatigue. So, what is RPE? RPE is rate of perceived exertion, and it was originally developed for endurance training. But so many sports are using it now because it seems to be super effective for putting a number to an intensity. So RPE is really just a scale from 1 to 10, and you can pick a number in an exercise to show, okay, this is what I'm actually feeling right now in this exercise, or it's a number to help you understand how you feel at the end of a session. So let's talk about what the scale is. So from 1 to 10, 1 being really easy, 10 being the hardest. 1 to 3 is very light exercise, or it feels very easy. Maybe it's your warm up. It could also be recovery exercises, and it's an intensity that you could just keep going forever. Now, RPE 4 to 6 is more of a moderate effort, where you still have a lot of reps left in the tank. You're working hard, maybe you're sweating. You could go for a moderate amount of reps. RPE 7 to 8. Now we're starting to get into the world of feeling hard. It feels hard but controlled. Maybe you have a couple reps left in the tank. RPE 9, now it feels really hard. Maybe you could do 1 more rep. Maybe you feel exhausted. And then RPE 10 is max effort. You're basically failing and you can't do any more. So how is RPE more effective than fixed percentages? I know we already talked about this, but basically traditional strength training programs uses a percentage of max weight lifted. So the problem is that daily strength fluctuates because of all of these factors: stress, nutrition, recovery, sleep. But RPE really allows for more flexibility. So instead of assigning percentages, you can assign RPE numbers to your sets and reps. All right. So then the other side of RPE is that it can be influenced by several different factors, and this can be good or bad. Some people can push harder depending on the type of music that's playing. Maybe they're watching a video that's super inspirational and it just helps to bring a little bit more energy to that session. Other factors could be temperature, who you're training with, how long you've been training, like this is your exercise experience. It also comes down to your fitness level, also how much you've eaten. Are you training at altitude? All of these things will affect your RPE, and that's totally okay because you're showing up that day in a certain state and you want to match your training or your exertion level to how you're feeling that day. So if RPE is a tool to understand your intensity or the level of exertion, another way that you can think about how much intensity you're bringing is called reps in reserve. It's really just how many reps you have left in the tank at the end of your set. And I actually really like this better as an approach compared to RPE, because sometimes we don't understand in our body what hard versus very hard versus I'm almost dying in this exercise. Especially for beginner trainees, this is going to be a lot harder to understand. So sometimes that terminology is not going to work, but we could potentially understand how much work we have left in a set. So reps in reserve is just another tool. And let's say, we use RPE together with reps in reserve. So if I am going for an RPE 8, which is roughly about 85%, then that means I most likely have about 2 reps left in the tank. So you can see how that kind of works really well together. So if I'm trying to go for RPE 9, now this is getting into the very hard category, RPE 9, it means I have about 1 rep left in the tank before I hit technical failure. So you can think about that next time you go to the gym when you're doing an exercise. Just see like how can you gauge how many reps you have left in the tank. And sometimes it is really good to go to failure, go to technical failure, go to volitional failure, and see what it feels like in your body. Now, the problem with going to failure, though, I'm going to follow this up with a caveat, is that if you are newer to training or if you're not super confident in your technique, then going to failure is probably not a good idea because it does increase your risk of injury. Now, I don't want this to scare you, but if you're going to be lifting heavy loads for your body, you have to feel like you're in control. So let's talk about what failure really means and the different types of failure, and then you can start thinking about this for your own training. So volitional failure is basically training to true fatigue. So that's continuing a set until your muscles physically cannot complete another rep, even if your form is really, really good. So let's say you're doing a bicep curl and you're aiming for 3 sets of 8 reps. Let's say by the 8th rep, you're no longer able to complete a full rep. And this would be without trying to do some sort of dynamic movement. So that would be hitting your volitional fatigue. Now, this is actually really great. So if you went to failure on that last set or that last rep, it is actually really great for hypertrophy. That means that we're trying to grow muscle, but it's not always necessary for max strength work. For climbers, we want both. We want max strength and we want some hypertrophy as well. But going to failure often leads to longer recovery times. All right, and more fatigue. I would say that volitional failure is great for an advanced trainee because they're going to have a lot more confidence in their movement. So if you're a beginner or intermediate lifter, then I would say don't use volitional failure as a gauge. Now, the second failure is technical failure. And this is what I try to tell most of my clients is that you want to stop a rep before you hit technical failure. So technical failure is once your form starts breaking down. So let's take the deadlift, for example. If you're lifting heavy for 5 reps, but you're taking a video and you review your video and you see that at rep 4, things are changing in your form, then really rep 4 is where you should be stopping and adjusting the weight so that you can actually complete 5 reps with really good form. Okay. So anytime that you notice a change in your technique, you should stop that set and actually try to adjust it so that you can stop before technical failure happens. The last strategy for understanding failure is velocity loss. So this is actually very practical for explosive training or power training, because once you see a reduction in your speed at all, then you're no longer getting the results of that exercise. So a lot of explosive training, you need to move as fast as possible for the reps assigned. But if you're seeing yourself slow down, you're no longer using the correct muscle type to do that exercise. When we're doing explosive movement, we're primarily using the fast twitch muscle fibers. And if you slow down, then you're probably using more of the slow twitch muscle fibers, and at that point you're really just training endurance, and you should just stop the rep or the set at that point, because you're no longer training the thing that you want to be training. So think about that when you're doing explosive movements. Maybe it's box jumps, maybe it's power pull-ups, anything like that. But you can also apply this training tool to strength exercises such as pull-ups or deadlifts. And once you notice that there is a change in the speed of the movement, you could consider stopping at that point, because it could just be pushing through the fatigue. And again, it's not going to lead to that more is better at this point. And again, it comes down to what it is that you're training for. So if you are going to push through a very slow movement, which I like to call grinding sets, you're most likely training for a little bit more of a hypertrophy effect, and your repetitions are going to be a lot higher. So probably more in like the 6+ range or the 8+ range. But if you're doing strength exercises or power exercises, those repetitions are going to be much lower because you're trying to focus on either heavy load or moving as fast as possible. So those are the 3 tools for understanding failure. So we got volitional failure, we got technical failure, and we got velocity failure or velocity loss. Use those as an understanding of where you're at and how well you're executing an exercise. And then you can start putting these together with RPE and reps in reserve. So now in strength training, we do have different goals for our training, such as max strength. We also have what's called functional strength. We have hypertrophy and explosive power. So when it comes to RPE for max strength, we're aiming for an 8 or a 9 out of 10. So that means you've got 1 to 2 reps left in reserve, and you should be pushing just before technical failure. So you've got 2 reps left in the tank before your technique fails. So for most of us, an RPE of 8 to 9 is perfectly fine. So then there's functional strength, which is essentially a combination of a neurological adaptation and a physical size adaptation. So we're putting together both max strength and hypertrophy kind of in this mid-range, which is called functional strength. So RPE 7 to 9 is going to be just fine here. So that's about 3 reps left in the tank. So 1 to 3 reps left. And again, I would say that it is a combination of going to technical failure. So 1 to 3 reps before you hit technical failure. And depending on the exercise, it could also be a velocity-based failure. So if you're really, like, you notice a really big change in how quickly you're doing your pull-ups, then I would just stop the exercise because you're not getting those adaptations that you want. Then there's hypertrophy. And so hypertrophy is growing muscle. And really the only way to do that is to hit that muscle with repetition. So that volume load needs to be a lot more. Oftentimes it's about 3 to 5 sets of 8 to 12 reps for a given exercise. And this can be more of a combination of technical failure and volitional failure. And the RP is going to be between 7 and 9. And then lastly, just to reiterate that power, this explosive movement, needs to be really focused hard on not changing the speed. The volume load for explosive power is about 3 to 5 sets of 1 to 5 repetitions, where the RPE is a little bit lower now, more like 6 to 8, where you actually feel comfortable and in control. And you'll stop when velocity changes. And of course, you're going to stop if technique changes. We just talked about RPE in an exercise, in a set. So how does that differ to a session RPE? So oftentimes you can hit a pretty high RPE in an exercise, but it doesn't mean that your session should be a high RPE. If you have been listening to this podcast or you know a lot of my content or your client, you've probably heard me say, leave your session feeling snappy. Now, that does not mean that you half-ass all of your exercises, that your RPE should be, in the 5 or the 6 range. You should still be trying really hard, but what you do is don't push yourself in that session to the point where you're feeling tired by the end of that session. You can work really, really hard and still leave that session with a lot left in the tank. And what that's going to do is actually start your recovery process for the next session. So leaving snappy means that you have energy by the end of the session and you could probably do more. And this just helps with long-term programming and for general injury prevention, and also stopping you from overtraining. Because if you continue to do really hard sessions over and over again, you're just going to dig yourself into a hole, and then you're going to show up to workouts not feeling really great. Maybe you can't bring your full self to these sessions, especially if you're going into a climbing session and you're asked to do limit climbing, but you just can't bring it. Why? Because you probably pushed too hard in your other sessions. So try to think about that anytime that you're doing single exercises you can push really hard, but also tap into how you're feeling generally. Do you still feel fresh by the end of that exercise? If yes, good, continue on. And then if you start to notice, okay, I'm starting to dip in my energy here, it's probably time to call the end of the session. Generally, with strength training, especially if it's programmed, you might not get to that end of the session feeling terribly fatigued. But I know that in climbing sessions, especially if you're climbing with friends and it's super fun, you're going to climb a lot more than maybe what your body is actually capable of. And then before you even know it, you are now super tired. Your forearms are just worked. They're on fire. You can't close your hands anymore. At that point, you have gone too far. So I think when it comes to climbing sessions, your session RPE is really important to focus on. Let's talk about how to adjust your session. So now that you kind of understand RPE, reps in reserve, some tools to understand what failure really is, how are you going to adjust your session? I think you already have a pretty good idea, but first you need to understand where your body is at that day. And the best place to start understanding is in your warm-up. And your warm-up is the best place to start asking questions to your body. How do these movements feel? Do you feel sluggish? Do exercises feel harder than they normally do? And if yes, just know that, okay, you're going to have to accept that maybe today is a lower intensity day and you're going to back off from the weights to match the RPE for that exercise and to make sure that your quality of movement is really high. Let's say that you are feeling actually really great. Maybe you feel snappier and things feel a lot easier. Then you know that, okay, actually today is going to be a really good day and you can anticipate increasing your weight a little bit to match that RPE. So it can go both ways. So let's say you want to lift 225 pounds for your deadlift, and really this is an RPE 8. But today you're feeling tired and it feels like an RPE 9. Then what you're going to do is actually decrease the weight so that you can match the reps for that set. What we don't want to do is stick with the weight and then have to decrease the reps. The rep and set range is there for a reason. Generally, that volume load helps you target specific adaptations. So what we talked about before, which is max strength, functional strength, hypertrophy, and power. So make sure that you are adjusting the weight so that you can hit those sets and reps instead of keeping the weight and adjusting the sets and the reps. That's how you adjust your RPE and your intensity for sets and reps. So now you're going to think about your session RPE. So if you know that you're already feeling really tired in your warm-up, have the expectation that this session might be a lot shorter, or that you're going to give yourself a lot more rest time between your sets. And it might be that you need to eat or hydrate a little bit more in that session, and it's just going to take a little bit longer. I generally say that if you're not feeling good and you have adjusted your weights to match the reps and sets, that you would also try to cut the session a little short so that you can allow your body to recover. Because obviously there's something going on. There's just not enough energy to be used for recovery. So if you can stop your session short, you already start your recovery process. So as a summary, use your warm-up as a really good place to start your gauge of performance. Match your weight to the RPE so that you can hit your target rep range and set range. Modify volume only if needed, especially if you're having a really bad day and you're reaching technical failure. I'd rather you adjust weight than adjust volume. And then lastly, think long-term. Some days are going to be harder. You're going to have bad days. Then you're going to have some okay days, and you're going to have some really good days. So think about auto regulation as a way to keep you progressing no matter how you're showing up that day without you burning out. So all of this was RPE for strength training. I hope that this helps you in your next session. And remember, this is a long-term view on training and that you really need to practice this in order to get better at it, because you really want to match intensity to your training goal. And this is really the only way that you're going to see adaptations in your training. So this was part 1. Part 2 and 3 are going to be coming very soon, and we're going to be talking about how to adapt this to hangboarding and climbing drills, as well as training energy systems. So if you liked this, please make sure that you give us a thumbs up and give us a rating on how you like this episode. And if you have any questions, did I miss something about RPE? I'd love to hear your thoughts and maybe even just your additions to how to properly train the right intensity. All right, we'll catch you in the next one.